This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we get an update on sports betting in Connecticut, how our efforts to expand gaming in the state impacting an agreement with Connecticut's two tribes to open another casino in East Windsor. Connecticut Public Radio's Frankie Graziano will give us an update. That's later. We'll also check in on the latest surrounding efforts to save the historic Nathan Hale Hotel in Willimantic, as leaders there also try to spur economic development on its main street. First, we hear about the role of SROs in local schools. SRO stands for School Resource Officer or Police Officer, who's hired by school boards to help make schools safer for students and staff. But should school administrators get SROs involved in routine discipline issues? A new report by Connecticut Voices for Children finds that happens more times than not, and the practice is disproportionately affecting particular students. For more on that study, joining us via Skype is Camara Stokes-Hudson. She's Associate Policy Fellow with Connecticut Voices for Children, also co-author of a study examining the impact of school resource officers on students. Camara, welcome to our show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I described what an SRO is, but how many of them are there in Connecticut, considering how many towns and cities, local school districts we have?
So we actually don't know the total number of school resource officers that exist in the state. We know that no more than around 24% of schools reported having school resource officers in the 2015-2016 school year, so now several years ago. But we don't have a total count of the number of individual officers.
That sounds like a problem, not being able to find that data. Why is that? There's no standard for school districts to follow, even when it comes to reporting guidelines to the state?
So there is no central requirement to report or a central place to report the presence of a school resource officer. So the State Department of Education does have a database called EdSite. That website includes quite a bit of information on a school-based level. One of the things that it doesn't include is whether or not a school has a school resource officer present. So there currently is no central repository for where the presence of school resource officers are, with the exception of a federal data collection called the Civil Rights Data Collection, which collects data every 2 years, which is why the last data year we have for this study is 2015-2016. But that's the only school level research we've been able to find, or school level data we've been able to find regarding the presence of school resource officers in the state.
So when a local school board enters into a contract with the local police department, it's the police department that assigns one of their officers or more than one to a particular school. And what are they allowed to do when they're in school, Camara?
So the practices are quite variant in terms of what the expectations of school resource officers are. And to be perfectly honest, to a certain extent, we can't tell what the agreements are between a lot of the school districts and police departments. So by Connecticut state statute, school districts, boards, local boards of education, and police departments that choose to have school resource officers have to have an MOU. The problem is the vast majority of those MOUs, which would outline memorandums of understanding, would outline the kind of rules of engagement, what the roles and responsibility of that school resource officer are, things like that, are not publicly available or not easy to find. And so it's very hard for us as individual citizens or us at Connecticut Voices for Children as researchers to be able to determine what the roles and responsibilities of the vast majority of SROs are in the state. What we do know from national research, though, is that the roles of SROs can vary, right? So oftentimes acting as school security, so doing external protection of the school, but also doing internal work, so things like teaching and mentoring, but also acting sometimes as a disciplinarian or someone that deals with the disciplinary needs of students, are all things that have been suggested as roles that school resource officers have across the country.
So why did Connecticut Voices for Children look specifically at the impact of SROs? What did you find, Camara?
Great. So I think we found four major things. Firstly, that on most measures of school safety, such as the use of weapons, drugs and alcohol, theft, property damage, the average numbers of incidences of such behavior didn't differ all that significantly between schools that did and did not have school resource officers. Second, that academic performance, as measured by the average number of students meeting or exceeding smarter balance benchmarks, also didn't differ all that much in terms of the presence of SRO. What we do find is that the presence of a school resource officer may contribute to more students experiencing exclusionary discipline. In this study, we looked at expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, and arrests. Students attending schools with school resource officers were a greater risk of discipline overall. But we know that the average arrest rate for Latino students at schools with a school resource officer was 6 times greater than the average arrest rate for Latino students in schools without a school resource officer. And then finally, we found that schools with school resource officers discipline students more often for things that are potentially non-criminal. So when you look at schools with school resource officers, they tend to report higher levels of school policy violations, which are things like skipping class, insubordination, using profanity, dress code violations. It's not clear from the available data, though, that we have whether SROs participated in the reporting of these policy violations.
So on the via Skype again with us is Camara Stokes Hudson. She's with Connecticut Voices for Children, co-author of a study examining the impact of school resource officers on students. So you reported 4 different, statements or what you found from the data, the limited data that you were able to find on school resource officers in Connecticut, Camara. So let's just back up. So when we think about the number of incidents versus schools that have SROs versus those that do not, you mentioned that there's really no correlation between if there's an existence of an SRO, that there might be less incidents than a school that doesn't have any SRO in terms of discipline and other issues?
So in terms of the presence of certain types of things like weapons or certain types, so we looked at a range of incidences that occur in schools. So each year, schools report individual incidences of certain things. When we looked at incidences of things that are potentially criminal, so weapons violations, drugs and alcohol violations, theft, property damage, things like that, the presence of an SRO didn't seem to really change anything, right? There wasn't a strong relationship between the presence of an SRO and a higher or lower rate of those events happening. What we did find was in the instance of things that are potentially non-criminal, so what we refer to as school policy violations, we saw a strong relationship or a larger relationship between the presence of school resource officers and the higher rates of school policy violations that we were seeing in those schools.
When we hear that Latino students are 6 times more likely to be arrested when they're involved with some kind of incident, what kind of incidents are leading to their arrests, Camara? Were you able to tell?
So we actually can't tell. The data set that we have only acknowledges that an arrest occurred. It also doesn't acknowledge any type of contact that could have happened with a student that didn't result in a formal arrest. And so there are lots of things that happen before an arrest and interactions that happen before arrests that can have massive impacts on students. But this only really tells us if an arrest occurred, not the reasons for it.
I'm curious if school resource officers reviewed these findings in this study. What is their response in, again, seeing that Latino students were disproportionately affected by arrest rates when SROs were involved in particular schools?
Great. So we did ask for feedback from a school resource officer who we had been working with, who had come to a series of our presentations on the research prior to us presenting it. We spent quite a bit of time in the build up to releasing this report doing something called data walks, which are like a series of community conversations about the research that we were doing so that we could get feedback from other people, from people who worked in education, who were in schools, but also school resource officers. But so someone who we built a relationship through that process was able to review the paper. We also had representatives of juvenile justice, advocacy also review the paper and so we basically had them review it in terms of factual accuracy if we were representing the research correctly, not necessarily to gain their direct opinions.
Mhm. So, what do you want to see happen after this? Again, the study has been concluded. What do you want to see policymakers, even local school boards, consider? Again, as we hear that the number of SROs have increased, especially after the Sandy Hook shootings.
Yep, exactly. So the first thing I really want to acknowledge, especially in the discussion surrounding Latino students, is that there isn't very much information we currently have on school resource officers in Connecticut. We think that this study is at best one piece of that story. But if those arrest rates are as high as they seem to be, we have a very serious problem on our hands that really requires a deep exploration. Because experiencing an arrest is extremely traumatizing for children and any of the people who are around them. It can push kids further and further away from educational opportunities, from job opportunities in the future. And so it's really important to understand why such disparate rates are occurring on Latino students. For that reason, one of our first requests is that the Connecticut legislature should request a study on the presence of school resource officers that includes a review of student discipline by race, gender, and disability status. Because of the data availability and the information regarding SROs that's publicly available, we just don't have enough information to make conclusive statements about the presence of school resource officers in the state. But we realize that a lot of the research we do have, both nationally and locally, because there is a report from the ACLU in 2008, suggests that we really do need to understand the implications of the presence of school resource officers before we put them inside of our schools, before we create memorandums of understanding around their presence to really understand what the impact of them is. So the first request we have is that a study on SROs should be done that includes a review of student discipline by race and gender.
So
the other request on the state as a whole is that Connecticut should require that questions about school resource officers are included in school climate surveys for any school district that has a school resource officer. So currently, school districts are required to provide their students with a school climate survey that asks them about a range of experiences inside of schools. We think that one of those experiences must be the presence of school resource officers. Student voice and understanding what each and every student feels about their school resource officer is a really, really important data point in terms of how we move forward with the presence of school resource officers in the state.
So, Camara, at this point, we just don't know enough to find out whether school administrators may be asking SROs within their schools to weigh in on routine discipline. The data is not there yet to be conclusive about that?
Exactly. We just don't have enough data to be conclusive at this point about many of the claims that are made about school resource officers. I think what this report should do for people and how people should understand this report is as a piece of the story about school resource officers that suggests to us that there might be a problem and that we need to dig much deeper into it. And have a very deep understanding of the presence of school resource officers that includes and centers the lives of students, of families, of communities that have been impacted by relationships with the police, because those are often the kinds of stories that are left out of these discussions. But this report really suggests to us that that is the next step, is a very in-depth analysis of the presence of school resource officers that is up to date, that uses all of the data that Connecticut has to be able to make an informed decision for all of us and for all of the children in Connecticut schools.
Camara Stokes-Hudson, again, is Associate Policy Fellow with Connecticut Voices for Children, also co-author of a study examining the impact of school resource officers on students. Camara will be interested to see how policymakers follow up on this study, but we appreciate your time explaining it to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
She joined us via Skype. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Up next, towns and cities are often looking for economic development opportunities. But what does that mean for historic structures in the path of redevelopment plans? We hear how municipal leaders and historic preservationists reached a compromise to save the Nathan Hale Hotel in Willimantic. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. What should preservationists and municipal leaders weigh when considering whether to save or demolish historic buildings? The town of Windham reached an agreement with preservationists to save the Nathan Hale Hotel in Willimantic. Now, to fill some of the backstory and explain why the state got involved, joining us now in studio is Susan Johnson. She's the Windham Democratic State Representative in the Connecticut General Assembly. Representative Johnson, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today.
Also with us is Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. Welcome to our studio, Jane.
Thank you.
So, Representative Johnson, tell us about, I mentioned that the settlement was with the town of Windham, but we're talking about Main Street in Willimantic. So describe that location in the city of Willimantic for our listeners who may not be familiar with it.
Sure. Our Main Street, our downtown Main Street, is very, very small. It's about a 6 or 8 block area. And there's a large part of Main Street that has been vacant for a number of years. First of all, the Nathan Hale building that was Eastern Connecticut State University dormitory, that was vacated pretty much in 1978. And then we had also the Hotel Hooker, which had been vacant, I think, for about 12 years or so. But in the meantime, it had been deteriorating before that. I was on the council in 1989 to 1992, and then again in 1999 to 2001. And one of the things that we were focused on was trying to make sure that our Main Street was getting developed. At the same time, we also had the YMCA building, and that also became vacant. So we had a hole in the middle of our downtown Willimantic, and it really eroded access to businesses. It really created a problem in terms of our image, having all these empty buildings that were deteriorating, dilapidated, didn't do very much for commerce. And I just have to God bless the businesses that stayed there and conducted business during that time, because they have been real troopers, and it's very difficult to do when you have a real hole in the middle of your Main Street.
So before it got to that condition, I believe, from my understanding, the Hooker Hotel was built first, then the Nathan Hale Hotel. But this was a time when things were really happening in Willimantic. Why was that, Representative Johnson?
Well, certainly we had a booming economy back in the days of the Industrial Revolution. We were Thread City. In fact, we have a bridge erected to the Thread City concept, and we have frogs on top of the bridge, which was also part of a book that was written called Legendary Connecticut. Eastern Connecticut State University professor wrote the book, and he went around and he got money to put the frogs on top of the spools. So we have a very interesting place, and it's really devoted to history. We have wonderful museums and all kinds of things that really are part of our history and our heritage. But unfortunately, as a member of the council back in 89 to 92, I worked really hard to make sure that we had housing code officials, go in there and try and make sure they made sure our buildings were up to code. And unfortunately, those kinds of efforts didn't quite work out. And
so these were historic buildings. They were listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And so when they were allowed to get into the condition that they were, it's problematic when a developer wants to come in, what can be done, right? So can you talk about some of that?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that we did, just going back a little bit, right after the Eastern Connecticut State University, which was ECSC, Eastern Connecticut State College at the time, left the Nathan Hale empty. We also had the Hotel Hooker that was being addressed with payments from the town through something called town assistance. So a lot of people who lived in the Hotel Hooker were actually receiving town aid. And at the same time, again, I tried to get the building done and all that stuff. But what happened is we also, about the same time when they created historic districts, we in 1983 created a historic district in our downtown area, a federal historic district. So we have that, and then all of a sudden came these new tax issues, fast forward to today, when they have these things called opportunity zones, historic district tax credits, all these things, and some of them look like they might be in conflict. Sometimes they can be coordinated, and sometimes they may be in conflict. But what we did is we had a private developer that was not interested in doing anything with getting historic tax credit money from the state of Connecticut, which is something that is also a very big sell in many, many communities. But my community is a distressed municipality. So when a developer comes into a distressed municipality, the return on the dollar is not going to be the same as it would be in a municipality that is booming and has lots of resources. So what we did is we took a look at what was going on, and the historic people who they have the best intentions in mind, and they really do care about our history, and so do I. But in terms of how we proceed, has been very, very different. They have an opportunity to get people in there and have the state look at whether or not what the developer is proposing or may do will actually conflict with the goals of trying to keep historic buildings.
So I want to bring Jane Montanaro into the discussion. Before we get there, though, what was the plan that the developer wanted to do that would have done something with both the Nathan Hale Hotel and the Hooker Hotel? What was the plan?
Well, the plan would be to let him have full decision making on all those buildings, and that there would be no interference from anyone. So the Hooker, of course, is a wood frame building and had deteriorated even since when I was on the council, because at that point in time, a couple of years later, it was completely empty because it was a building that was dangerous for the people to live in. So they have something called the Relocation Assistance Program. Actually, I actually wrote the ordinances for relocation assistance for the town when I was on the council. And so the Relocation Assistance Program was utilized to move the people who were living in the Hotel Hooker out into other places because the foundation was crumbling. It's a wooden frame. And then after that, somehow it got into state surplus ownership, along with ECS, the former dormitory, the Nathan Hale, and the YMCA building across the street. That's kind of what happened. So the state ended up owning all those buildings, and they were trying to sell them. And actually, just as a point of information, I was on the finance committee when the buildings were sold in 2014 to the LLC that was also part of the Willimantic Waste Paper Company, the DeVille family. So they're the ones that had it, and they had been working. They had donated the YMCA building, and I just want to say the YMCA building looks exactly like it used to look back in the day, and they had done a whole refurbishing there that was not necessarily part of anyone's concerns because of the horrible facade that was on there before.
This is Where We Live. We're getting some context to a situation in Willimantic where two hotels that were on the National Register of Historic Places, also a part of Willimantic where municipal leaders wanted to see economic development. And this was a battle that happened for a long time about what to do with an area that is distressed. As Representative Susan Johnson is explaining to us here on Where We Live, she represents the town of Windham. Also in studio with me is Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. So Jane, we've gotten the context from Representative Johnson about this idea that these properties had been so dilapidated. They wanted to bring business to an area that was distressed, but there's also something to weigh, which is the historic value of these buildings. And so tell us how you got involved, again, as Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation.
Yes. The Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation is the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization, and we work with municipalities and individuals and nonprofit organizations and jointly with the community to resolve and protect historic resources in their communities. The National Register listing by itself does not have any regulations. It's really an honorific listing. And in Willimantic, there was not a demolition delay ordinance or a local historic district or any other trigger besides the National Register nomination for local preservationists to speak up and try to protect these buildings. In Connecticut, we have a very special legislation, the Connecticut Environmental Protection Act, which protects historic structures in the same way that it protects quality air, water, and we're able to work with local constituents who have a concern about a property on the National Register, and we can bring in resources. We brought in an engineer and an architect, both toward the Hale building and the Hooker building, both in the middle of the winter when there was ice and, they were at their worst condition possible, but we went through and we got a good look at the buildings. Our engineer is experienced in dealing with historic structures and has studied over 1,000 historic structures, and her report on the Hale building was that was very structurally sound. It's 1926 concrete building, which coincidentally was built with public money. It was the public raised money to build that hotel when they had the big boom in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
So we heard Representative Johnson mention the historic people who came in and wanted to see these buildings saved. Given what the architect and others said, that the idea being that maybe there was a way to keep the Hale Hotel and try to find a way to keep it into the plans of economic development if this developer was interested in building housing there?
Yes, so the beauty of a historic district is that you have a number of structures all together, working together to create the streetscapes, the speaking with one another, the architecture, really defining a space. And once you start to erode that by letting one building go here, one building go there, I believe when the district was listed in 1982, there were over 60 structures existing, and we've lost quite a few of those since the 1980s. So it's really important to try to keep that district intact.
So explain why the state attorneys general got involved. The state AG's office got involved in this situation when we're thinking about trying to save historic places in our state.
Yes. So the Connecticut Trust looks at the integrity of the buildings that the constituents are asking for protection on, and we also look at the level of local support for those buildings. We felt that there was enough of an outcry in the community to bring this to the Attorney General's attention. There was a petition of over 750 names on it. A lot of those were gathered during Shop Small Saturday. So I think that speaks to the draw that community has as a commercial district, bringing people from outside Willimantic to come and shop and eat and enjoy downtown Willimantic. So we were able to work with the State Historic Preservation Office and present a case to the Historic Preservation Council, and that council did do their monthly meeting in Willimantic so that everyone in Willimantic who would like to speak on behalf of the structures or on behalf of the developer and the new development were given an opportunity to speak. So the council listened to testimony for over 3 hours and then voted to refer the matter to the Attorney General. Really, the whole point of having this Connecticut Environmental Protection Act is for a situation like this where parties were not coming together to have a conversation and bringing the Attorney General in to try to find mutual ground in a settlement that would be productive for everyone was really a benefit for this legislation. And
so tell us what the settlement is.
So the settlement is between the State of Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office and the developer. They are allowed to demolish the Hooker Hotel, which was a wood frame building that had the most deterioration, but they are to reuse the Hale Hotel, which is the concrete larger structure. They are not using any federal or state money, so there are no restrictions. Typically in historic preservation projects, we refer to the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are guidelines that ensure that the most historic fabric and treatments are used. So in this case, with federal money, there aren't any other overlays to ensure that those standards are met. And it even says in the settlement that it doesn't have to be to Secretary of the Interior standards. So that's a little bit of a low bar for us, but we'll take a victory that the building will still be standing.
Representative Johnson, is this a good compromise?
I'd say so, yes. And I'm very, very pleased that everybody was able to come together with the Attorney General and do another analysis, taking into consideration everybody's concerns. Of course, someone who has been involved since the 1980s, trying to make sure, because I was on the Zoning Board of Appeals before that, trying to make sure we do something with our Main Street, and having numerous studies done over and over saying, got to do something with the middle of Main Street. This has been something that I've been working on for many, many, many years, as is many of the other people in our town. And so I am very, very pleased with the result, and that we're going to have a developer who is very pleased to work with us. And I might want to add a couple other things. One is we have zoning rules that require that we keep a historic look to our downtown, even if the building is not exactly the exact same materials and everything. We had a building called the Capitol Theater building that was being redone back in the 1980s, and 3/4 of it crumbled. And you take a look at it today, you wouldn't know that it was all rebuilt. And I think that the same thing with the YMCA buildings that I was mentioning before. I have pictures of the old YMCA building in my house. And I took a look at how they did that over. And again, we have facades that are all duplicated, and the pictures look just like what we have on Main Street now. So I think a lot of this stuff can be done over and can be done to make it look just like it did look when it was built originally. And it wasn't that long ago. If you look at the 1920s, it's really not. I mean, I guess I'm showing my age now, but
Representative Johnson, some of our listeners might be wondering why we're taking such a deep dive into this situation in Willimantic, but there are ramifications for different communities around the state. You and a colleague have proposed legislation that would help towns and cities like Willimantic that have distressed areas try to figure out a way where historic preservation is not something that will keep developers from coming in. Can you talk a little bit about the bill?
Absolutely, yeah. So I have to say we had proposed something that was a little more far-reaching, and after working and listening to the people from the Historic Preservation Council and talking to people, we realized that really what the problem here is that the intervention of the historic preservationists in distressed municipalities that are small and have a real difficult time expanding their tax base, it might be getting in the way, particularly when you look at the tax credit part. Tax credit part is they give the same tax credit money to people in, say, towns like Greenwich that they would in a distressed municipality, when the return on the investment is much, much lower in a distressed municipality than it would be in a place like Greenwich. So that right away there's an inequity. And I, as a state representative for Windham, a distressed municipality, I've been looking at inequities in distressed municipalities for my last 11 years. And I'm very, very charged up about that. So just say.
But Jane Montanaro, again, Executive Director of Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, these bills are problematic from the historic preservation side.
Yes, indeed.
And explain why.
Well, actually, I'd like to address Representative Johnson's point that the tax credits, when you look at the list of the tax credits that Connecticut issues and the feds issue in Connecticut, a large majority of them, they do go to distressed municipalities naturally, Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven. There's very few that come up in Greenwich or other communities like that. And the State Historic Preservation Office has also talked about setting policy that will earmark a certain amount of the tax credit, which is capped at $31.4 million. They're looking at a policy that would earmark about $12 million of that specifically for distressed municipalities.
Can we talk, though, about this bill and why historic preservationists are upset about this idea of trying to get around when places are deemed historic, but being able to push through development?
Sure. So the bill actually would have impacted our work in Willimantic. So it was trying to carve out some segments of the population that where historic properties would fall underneath the Connecticut Environmental Protection Act. And for historic preservation reasons, we thought that was very dangerous because, as you saw in Willimantic, the process played out. We were allowed to bring in the Attorney General, and the result for the historic, for saving historic buildings really wasn't a big win, but it was something. There was a compromise made. So I don't think that the process needs to be changed. I think that it actually needs to be strengthened because when you have these pressures of the Opportunity Zone funding coming into distressed municipalities and municipalities that are definitely very eager to have that investment and looking for their savior to come in and help right the communities, this puts a lot of stress on the historic assets that we have in these communities that are already, struggling to survive, but so important to maintaining our cities and our streetscapes and our communities. And the people that live and work in those communities feel so passionate about keeping a piece of their heritage. Mm-hmm. And it can all work together. It can new construction and historic preservation and economic development. We have models that show that these are not mutually exclusive. They can all work together.
Representative Johnson, we just have a couple of minutes left. Can you tell us the status of those bills and also lessons for other municipalities and residents who are listening right now?
Sure, and I just wanted to focus on one part of the bill that addresses the fact that it's an opportunity zone. Just because you have a distressed municipality and you have historic districts, not all the historic districts are in opportunity zones. So I just want to make that clear. So the focus of the bill was to address historic districts that are also in opportunity zones in distressed municipalities. And it ended up being 3 or 4 municipalities that actually would have been impacted by that.
As far as the bills that we were talking about?
Yes, the bill that we're talking about now. So now we are looking at trying to make sure we work with the historic preservation folks and that we do the historic tax credits so that they're going to be focused a little bit more heavily on the different municipalities that are distressed, and maybe help with that. And also I'm hoping to work with everybody to try and make sure that we don't run into the same problem we ran into with the hotel hooker, that we get maybe some help from the historic councils to try and make sure that if we have older buildings in these municipalities, that we help out the owners before these things fall into disrepair, before they're abandoned. Having these abandoned buildings in neighborhoods where little children are walking back and forth to school, all these kinds of things, people living next door to abandoned buildings or having a business next door to abandoned buildings, these are all things that people suffer with in their neighborhoods. They're living with it. And so we need to try and be sensitive to that as well and try and make sure that we work on those places in our distressed municipalities. I'm very looking forward to doing that.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in to tell us about this compromise, again, reached to save the Nathan Hale Hotel in Willimantic. Representative Susan Johnson, again, who represents Wyndham. Thanks so much for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also, Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. Jane, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we're going to get a quick update on sports betting from Connecticut Public Radio's Frankie Graziano. You can join us too, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, as technology advances and the workforce changes, what's the value of a liberal arts degree? On the next Where We Live, we're going to hear more about how high-tech giant Infosys has teamed up with Trinity College to find some new hires. And we want to hear from you, too, that conversation tomorrow. Also, just a reminder, Where We Live is coming to a coffee break near you. We're going to continue our coffee break series, this time in Waterbury at the John Bale Book Company and Cafe. That's Tuesday, May 21st. You can go to Where We Live's Facebook page for more information. And now we're going to get an update on sports betting, something that Connecticut Public Radio's reporter Frankie Graziano has really been deep into. And we're also curious about the future of that third casino in East Windsor, which we've talked about several times here on Where We Live. Frankie, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Lucy.
So tell us, what's happening with first the East Windsor Casino? You were doing some reporting asking Governor Lamont last week about the status of that East Windsor Casino.
Gaming issues are so complicated. Everything seems to be rolled up in one because of these negotiations that the tribes and the governor are having. I can get to the casino in a little bit, but basically what happened was there's all these gaming bills that are on the table, and there was this conference in Hartford, and Lamont spoke to like a gaggle of reporters. And he had said one thing, right? He had scrum. He said one thing about sports betting, but he left out one big detail that he had essentially diagnosed that nothing was going to happen this session with sports betting. So after he had spoke, he was confronted by reporters, and then he eventually comes back after this strategy session he kind of had with a gaming CEO that was there behind a partition at the conference. He comes back and says that sports betting likely won't happen this session, and he says that he wants all these gaming bills to be resolved under one global solution.
I'd love to make a deal with Rodney. I'd love to make a deal with Mohegan and MGM in a way that I honor my compact with Rodney and the tribes. It includes internet, it includes sports, but I'm not going to do it if we don't have a global solution.
We heard Governor Lamont reference Rodney. That's Mashantucket Pequot CEO Rodney Butler. So tell us why the tribes are tied into this idea of whether sports betting will be in Connecticut.
Yeah, and you heard Butler was also at that thing, and he says that basically the deal that they have with the states, they have some compacts with the state. They say that it's working for them, and that essentially if you look at these compacts, that's what the state agreement is with the tribes. The tribes give the states 25% of all revenue that they get from slot machines. And Butler says, hey, that deal seems to work for us. And if anything happens that's new with gaming, the state would basically have to amend their compacts with the tribe. So Rodney Butler says basically that the deal works for them.
The current deal is a great deal. I mean, it's contributed $8 billion to we have a great partnership, right? And so it's how do we enhance that in a way that benefits everyone, and we'll continue to work towards that. And whether it's this session, special session, next session, it is what it is, but it's going to take time to figure it out.
I'm not sure that answers your question, Lucy, but it shows you some of the complexities that are with these deals, and that we need to have the governor having these conversations with the tribes.
So sports betting, after the reporters pressed Governor Lamont, he's saying that that's not going to happen this legislative session. Was that a surprise at that point?
A surprise, because he hadn't said it yet. I guess he had told another reporter, and that's kind of what led to, hey, maybe the governor's not being fully truthful, or at least isn't really illuminating everybody as to what's happening in these negotiations. But sports betting likely won't happen, and there may be a special session. But either way, it seems that because of all these things are being rolled into one, it shows you that here in Connecticut we're having trouble getting in on some of these issues related to sports betting, which is something that should be revenue that the state should be taking in relatively soon.
You've been doing a lot of reporting on this idea of sports betting in Connecticut, surrounding states doing it. How much money does Connecticut now stand to lose if sports betting doesn't come here, Frankie?
When sports betting was enacted in May of 2018, there was a Supreme Court ruling that struck down this agreement that basically says that you can't have sports betting outside of Nevada. 7 states, including Rhode Island, since then have jumped in on sports betting. Everybody thought that Connecticut, at least like industry, I shouldn't say everybody, but industry kind of people, thought that Connecticut would be among the first wave. But there was always that caveat that the unique tribal involvement could change things. And now we know to this extent that there's been 2 legislative sessions without sports betting, that there certainly is a big involvement. Joe Varenja, who's a lawmaker out of West Hartford, who has been involved in this, he's been exploring the sports betting market since the beginning, says that the state could make $30 million by year 3 of implementation. That's in a fully mature market, though, from what I understand. So that includes mobile betting, which is supposed to be this great thing that people have because you can bet from your phone, right? You can make these bets, and it's supposed to give you better access. Instead of waiting in line, but then
it's great if you don't have an addiction to gambling, Frankie.
And we covered that in a series that we recently did on sports betting, and folks can learn more about that at WNPR.org. But Lucy, you're right. That could lead to, I've understand, like maybe two times more of people having issues with gambling addiction in the state.
So I started off wondering about the status of that third casino in East Windsor. It had been delayed because they were waiting for a decision from the U.S. Department of Interior if the state could even proceed with this agreement between the two tribes because it's off casino land.
It was a thought originally, Lucy, that it was going to be a foregone conclusion that thing would go down within like 45 days. It took a year and a half for them to get that approval. So that's one major hurdle. But now what I'm hearing is that there's like a second hang-up, and that comes from Mashantucket CEO Rodney Butler that we talked to Wednesday. He said that they're still trying to secure funding to build that $300 million casino. That's not a foregone conclusion either, because if you're looking at revenue estimates that the state gets from sports betting, that's one thing that tells us that the tribes are making less money on slots because excuse me, I said sports betting, but that tells us that the tribes are making less money on slots, and therefore the state is too because they're not getting that revenue from the compacts. So that's one thing. But I've also heard from a source that the Mashantucket Pequot tribe in particular has a debt to revenue ratio that's like 3 times more of where it should be. So that tells you that things aren't a foregone conclusion on that front. In terms of funding being secured for that proposal in East Windsor, that's something that a lot of people in that area are holding on to because it's supposed to bring jobs, it's supposed to bring additional revenue in there. But one thing I have heard to the positive is that some homes have been cleared alongside Route 5 in East Windsor near the proposed site. And I've also heard from tribal representatives that once they do break ground, it should take about 18 months to build. So we'll see.
Meanwhile, MGM is looking at this situation because they have that new casino in Springfield. They don't want that direct competition, which has been the problem all along with them trying to interfere with what the tribes are hoping to do with the state of Connecticut.
There is such a rivalry between MGM and the tribes, and I guess now the state of Connecticut is enveloped into it because MGM's wanted to get in on commercial business with the state of Connecticut for almost 2 decades now. So the state of Connecticut basically makes this joint venture with the Mashantucket Pequot and the Mohegan tribes, the tribes that run the Mohegan Sun and Foxwoods Casino, to get this casino in East Windsor. And as you said, they're not happy about that because they want to build a commercial casino. They're saying that's off tribal land, so it's a commercial casino. And they're also saying that it's not an open bidding process. So now there's a potential for a legal challenge, a lawsuit. And that's something that Governor Lamont and the state of Connecticut don't want.
Before we wrap, Frankie Graziano, again, Connecticut Public Radio reporter, you mentioned special session might be happening. Tell us what you know about when that'll be scheduled and exactly what they'll be looking at during that special session.
I don't know much about the special session, Lucy. I got to be honest with you because as we're seeing from that whole Lamont fumble last week, I don't think a lot of people know what's happening with these negotiations. The lawmaker I talked to, Varenja, as I talked about earlier, he said he didn't even know about the diagnosis from Lamont about gaming bills or a special session until our news came out there. So it seems like if there is a special session, it would take place after June 6th, which is when the Connecticut General Assembly closes. Like I said, he's down for, the guy I was talking to, Varenja, he's down for comprehensive look at gaming, and the Connecticut General Assembly going to a potential special session shows you that could happen, but he did express frustration that there's no deal yet on sports betting.
Well, Frankie Graziano, thank you for that update. Again, this is a story that continues to evolve, but we thank you for coming in to tell us what you know about the latest surrounding sports betting as well as that third casino in East Windsor. Thanks so much, Frankie.
Thank you, Lucy.
Today's show produced by Scott Breedy. Thanks to Katie Tolarski, who was on our board today, and Lydia Brown on phones. Again, we're going to be in Waterbury for one of our last coffee breaks of this season. So you can go to Where We Live's Facebook page for more. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.